Hi, I'm the Ancient Ninja, and this is the Nexus of Truth. So, today's topic is one that I could talk about for hours. I think that it's absolutely essential when it comes to discussing the application of theology to the battle of the sexes, especially with the rise of feminism and the impact that it's had on society. The title of the video is The Garden of Eden Deception: How It Programmed Humanity but Also Served as a Divine Chess Move. So, whether or not you're someone that claims to be religious or has even studied the biblical text, this story is probably one that you have heard before because it's really a foundational story. I mean, the Garden of Eden is a base for understanding many things in life, and it has been referenced plenty of times when we're talking about men and women and their roles in society. So I want to get into why I believe the Garden of Eden story is deceptive. So no matter what book you read it from, the translation, because there's been tons of translations of the Bible, it doesn't matter which one you read it from, they all pretty much have the same story. And I believe, as do other people, it's not just a theory of mine that I just came up with, though there would be nothing wrong with that because the world needs new perspectives, that Genesis has been altered. So Genesis is a part of one of the 5 books of Moses, and it's actually the only one that can't be verified to actually have been written by Moses. There's a theory that talks about this, which is the JEPD theory, the JEPD theory, which I'll link below, that goes into discussing how all of the other books that Moses wrote add up, but parts of Genesis just kind of, seem as if they may not be written by Moses. So there have been scholars that have talked about this and discussed it in theory, and really, there's no way to prove whether or not it was written by Moses, but I want to really talk about the story itself and how it's been incredibly deceptive. So, of course, many people who talk about the Bible, most of them, I would say 90% of them haven't ever actually read it. In the beginning of the story, it tells a couple different things. So they even have this thing where they say Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because if you start reading it, it goes on to say God created man and woman. So in the beginning, it says God created man and woman on the 6th day, and then on the 7th day he rested. And then it goes in to say how God formed Adam. So this, some scholars say, well, it's just a more in-depth look at how he was making man and woman. But it leaves one to think, well, if it says in the beginning that God made man and woman, then how come when it starts talking about him forming Adam, it claims that the woman came after? So there's a discrepancy there on understanding exactly what that means. Did God make man and woman together, or did God form Adam and then form the woman? Now, of course, in another video, I could go into how I believe that the Adamites were not the first people here on earth. I believe that there was other races here. Of course, this was after the angels were kicked out of heaven. So there's a lot that goes into this story in the beginning of Genesis. A lot is happening that you kind of are like, what's going on here, and that's why it gives the impression that it was an altered story, and that there was a tinkering in the story to make it seem as if Eve was the fault of everything. There's actually a really great story, too, that I'm going to link below called The Rape of Eve, where a very intelligent woman goes into her theories comparing the story of Adam and Eve to Apollo and Daphne, and it really gives way into saying that, because Eve means life, mother of living, it gives way into saying that Eve is a lot more than we give her credit for. But so something that really got me in the story was when he's forming Adam and he's putting Adam in the garden, he tells Adam, do not touch the tree. Now, there were 2 trees in the garden, okay? There was the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge is the one that supposedly we went up to and went against God's word and ate. The apple, which I have a phrase called the apple didn't exist, because of course there was no mention of it actually being an apple. There's even speculation that it wasn't a fruit. I'll get into that a little bit later, but in it he tells Adam to not touch the tree. Now, when he forms the woman, which again, conflicting Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, but we're just going to stick to Genesis 2 where we're breaking down when he's talking to Adam. When he forms Adam, then Adam goes into a deep sleep, and he then pulls the woman from Adam, the rib. He never tells the woman not to eat from the tree. So there's never a part where God mentions to Eve, don't eat from the tree. Yet this historic representation of this story has been that Eve just didn't listen and she just wouldn't eat it. But we never see in the story where God tells woman not to eat it. So that's the first discrepancy right there. So if we're going to blame Eve for eating the apple, is it really her fault if she was never told not to eat it? That there was never a discussion had with Adam. Is there something missing there? Are we not getting the full context? So that's one of the discrepancies when it comes to that. So when the serpent's in the garden, and I'd like to point out too that something that really got me about this story was God is all-knowing. God knows everything. God knows where you're at. God knows what you're doing. God knows what you're going to do. Now, of course, God putting Adam and Eve in the garden and giving them the choice was so free will could reign. God said, you have the choice to love me or hate me. God wanted that because before what God had created the angels, they did not have free will. And of course, like I said, another video, I could explain the ones that were created before us, though they had free will, they still defied God. Now, the difference between us and those before us is we actually felt remorse for what we did. In it, after we sin and defy what God said, notice God comes into the garden and we're like Adam and Eve are nervous and they feel naked and they feel bad for what they did, which is very new to God because it's like, wow, you feel remorseful for what you did? That's beautiful. And even to this day, humans still, we feel remorseful for our sin. We have guilt and things like that, which really set us apart from everyone else. But so in the garden, one, how would God just let the serpent in the garden, right? How would the serpent, this serpent can mean anything. The serpent at this time is obviously a person, and can also, be an animal. Two things can be true at once. So the serpent is something I'll get into later that could be multiple things, but this is where I believe it was a divine chess move, because when the serpent's in the garden, how would have God not known the serpent would get in there? So we either have two theories. One, either the God that is being talked about in the Bible isn't our God, or God knows that the serpent's going to enter the garden. God knows that the serpent's going to come in and try to get the humans to defy God. So that leads me to think that, well, if this is our God that has created us and put us in the garden, knowing that the serpent's going to be able to enter, okay, knowing that the serpent's going to talk us into the deception, is it perhaps that this is essentially a sacrifice of the queen, right? And if you've never played chess, I'll kind of give you an explanation of what that is. In chess, your king is your main piece. You lose your king, the game's over. Your queen is your second most powerful piece. Now, the queen can move any single way on the board. You can lose your queen and still continue the game. However, if you can get one of your pawns to the other side of the board on where your queen would have been, you can then get your queen back. So this kind of reminded me of that, because at this time, God has created a bunch of different things. You know, we're entering a story where creation's already been happening, which would align with many other ancient texts and explain all of the different types of creation. But at this point, God has angels that now have came down and sinned, because God sent them down to the earth, and they then became an extension of the sin that is on earth. And God's also having the creations that he had who are on earth just being terrible and destroying humanity. So how can God finally end this once and for all? Well, what better way than to get his creations, the Adamites, who are his best creations, made in his image, right, to become divine? And that leads me to another point. When it says in the beginning of Genesis that God made us in his image, why would God care if we ate the fruit? And we're going to be hypothetical here, ate the fruit, or that we got the knowledge. Aren't we supposed to be like God? How else would we be like God if we didn't get God's knowledge? So that's also other little things that lead me to believe that God purposely set this tree up for two reasons. One, we had to choose. We had to make a choice. We had to have free will. And two, because God knew that the little serpent was going to weed his little way in and try to convince us of the sin, and had to have something to convince us of that sin. So that would imply that God did let the serpent enter. Now, this also would back up some other theories that I have, that I'm going to make another video where I talk about how the devil was never actually an angel. And it would explain exactly how the serpent got into the garden. Because there's many discussions and conversation about where the garden is at. When you read the Emerald Tablets, which is by Thoth. Now, keep in mind, that's why the Bible is a key, because it's written in so many different languages and it has references to many other different things, that even if Genesis was altered, which I believe it was, you can't beat God. So even the little trickles of the things that they tried to change, it still leads us to the truth. Now, in the Emerald Tablets, it talks about the garden being between the corruptible and incorruptible. So it talks about it being in that certain place, which would mean that the garden is in a very sacred, divine place. So it will lead you to think, well, how would the serpent enter that? Well, in another video, when I go into my theory about the devil and what that is, it'll kind of explain how the devil would have gotten there. But earlier when I mentioned how the fruit was not an apple, or even edible, in the Emerald Tablets, it talks about the flower of life being in a minty. And a minty is basically hell. And it says the flower can be seen in the halls of a minty. And that would even more so kind of imply that the garden is in between these pillars of heaven and earth, right? And also, if you read the book of Enoch, which is going to be something I'm kind of getting into next, the book of Enoch is one of the books that were left out of the classical Bible. So to read the book of Enoch, you can't really find it in many Bibles. The Ethiopian Bible, I believe, it's the most complete Bible, so it has it in there. But the book of Enoch is absolutely incredible, and it goes into a little bit of detail about the garden and about Adam and Eve and all of those things. Absolutely wonderful. I recommend everyone read that. It talks about it being paradise, and it discusses where the garden is. So when you put these things with the Emerald Tablet and Genesis, it really starts to paint a picture that the garden is in this very incredible place that's between heaven and hell. And so it's also an extension of God's purpose for man. Now, what would this deception serve? Why would the powers that be, let's just say, why would they want to alter Genesis? Well, over time, this narrative of Eve being the one to blame, not listening to the man, well, it's painted a picture, which that might be the second time I've used that phrase, that women are just terrible, destructive, and they don't listen, and it's really kept this narrative going for a long time. I even hear people that are in the red pill community reference it like, oh, well, if she would have just listened to her husband, and then you look back at the story and you're like, oh, am I missing something? Because none of that was said here. So it painted, I almost said painted the picture good. It created this narrative that the feminine, the divine feminine, which Eve, keep in mind, is the first divine feminine. She is the example of all that is divine, even after they sinned. And Mary, who had Jesus, so to correct that, right? That's why, although they claim the woman was the one deceived by the serpent, well, she's the one victorious over it in the end because she's the one that has Jesus, God, in her stomach. So that's why you'll find depictions of Mary stepping on the serpent's head, because that was supposed to be a little correction. So this narrative has made it seem like women were terrible, and it goes through, and you really start looking into history and you look at women in the way that they were portrayed, in the way that they were seen, and the things that are said about them. All of the depictions of women in a negative way can be traced back to the original interpretation of the Garden of Eden story. So I think that's kind of one huge reason, and now we even see it playing out because you look at feminism and what feminism has done, and how it obviously was purposed to control the education of women, because some of the greatest women of all time, which I want to go into detail about them, I would do in another video, but they were women they read so much, and they were self-educated, and they were just incredible women that help advise the most noble men of all time. So I truly believe, just like as Mary had Jesus in her womb for 9 months and gave birth to him, that the divine feminine is what will heal the world. Because think of it this way, women stand for compassion and kindness, and what happens when you destroy the divine feminine? You destroy the compassion in the world. And we're seeing it happening in front of us because women are not even wanting to be compassionate anymore. It's seen as a weakness. Men are starting to not like women. We have things like MGTOW and all of these different movements, and it's destroying the family. It's destroying the connection between man and woman. And really, it can all be based back to this original story of the woman being the reason for sin. So that's kind of a little bit about the deception, the Garden of Eden deception, and why I believe it programmed humanity. Now, when it comes to the divine chess move, I think that this was something God knew God had to do, right? Had to fool the serpent, because the thing about evil, however you want to put it, the bad guys, is they're very arrogant. So if God were to set this little divine trap in the garden, the serpent would definitely fall for it, and it would be something the serpent would think, oh, look what I did, I got them to sin against you. But in reality, what it did is, yes, it opened us up to sin, it opened us up to all of these things. But as Jesus showed us through being born in the story of Jesus, the archetype that is Jesus, that we go through this life and we are to die and be reborn into literal gods, into the expression of God. So humans are the one piece to the puzzle that is going to be the one that finally ends the reign of sin, essentially. And it's kind of like on that chessboard when, okay, you give up your queen, got to give it up for a second, but then God's slowly moving that pawn piece across the board to get to the other side, and gets the queen back and inevitably wins the game. Because when you make that move, if your opponent is not smart enough to understand what you're doing, you can win the game very quickly. And for God, it's only probably been like a couple of months, relative to time and how things work. So, yeah. I hope that has been informative. I hope you guys could keep up with what I was saying and understand kind of what I mean. So that's really why I think that the Garden of Eden, the original story, Genesis, was altered, and it was meant to be used against us and used as a way to kind of set us off track. And I believe there's other parts of the Bible that have been altered as well, that have been used to kind of shape the way that we think, and it also, it does a multi-purpose, because when you do that to something as important as the Bible that has shaped the way humanity functions, you create this idea that, oh, well, the Bible is just used to control people. Well, not exactly. It's been altered by those who want to control humanity. So that doesn't necessarily mean the Bible was made for that. It just means that we really have to have God's discernment and break down these things and read for ourselves and try to understand them. And I don't think many people do that, because many people just will Google quotes from the Bible, or they'll say things off, and it's like, I don't think you actually even read it yourself or try to get your own understanding. So that's why on this channel I decipher certainties and I go over them again with a new perspective, because you never know how much the game can change when you just have someone else offer up a new perspective on it. So yeah, I hope that's been informative. I'm going to link a lot of things that I talked about below. I suggest reading the Emerald Tablets, reading Book of Enoch. These are all very long reads, but it's going to be way worth it when you really start connecting the dots. And all of these ancient texts, they're all connected in a way, and I think that was kind of the point. That is why the Bible is written by so many different people and written in so many different languages, so we could kind of understand, hey, even when evil forces try to alter it and try to control us, the truth is always still there. You just have to be able to discern it. So yeah, hope you guys liked the video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and always keep it pointy.